In the heart of Greendale Heights, a neighborhood where each house seemed to breathe prestige and perfection, Julia Marston lived in a home that once echoed with laughter and love, now reduced to a gallery of shadows. The mansion stood tall like a monument to past glory, dressed in ivy and guarded by wrought iron gates, but inside it was colder than winter's breath. The woman who once floated down its polished corridors now walked with quiet heaviness in her bones. Her husband Donovan, whose love had once wrapped around her like a woolen shawl in harmattan, had become a stranger with a familiar name. He came home like a visitor, kissed her like a habit, and spoke to her like a business client. The warmth in his eyes had long evaporated, replaced by an emptiness that frightened her more than rage ever could. Love had exited through the back door, and silence had taken a seat at the table. Julia saw the signs, the dwindling affection, the missed calls, the scent of foreign perfume on his shirts, but she wore her pain like a mask, painted with grace. To the outside world, she was still the lady of the house. But in the corners of her heart, she was a widow to a living man. Vanessa Bright came like a chameleon in a red dress, bold, unapologetic, and slithering into spaces where trust once lived. She had a voice like honey steeped in poison, and a laugh that cracked through walls like thunder. Donovan introduced her as his colleague, but Julia could see how his posture changed when Vanessa entered a room. She saw how his smiles came easier, how his phone found the silence button when Julia stepped in. Still, she said nothing. Her restraint wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. She understood that screaming at thunder didn't stop the rain. So she watched from the staircase as Vanessa's visits became frequent, as her laughter drifted from the living room like a haunting melody. Julia's nights became battlegrounds between her dignity and her breaking heart. She turned to scriptures like a parched throat to water, whispering Psalm 34, verse 18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. On one of those nights, as Donovan left with barely a word, she stood before the mirror and whispered to her reflection, "Hold on, Julia. Hold on a little longer. The tide always turns." Though she wore designer gowns and diamond earrings, loneliness fit her like a second skin. The help in the house noticed the shift. The driver no longer asked if she and Donovan were dining out. The cook began preparing half portions. The maid avoided eye contact. Even the walls, once painted with memories, now seemed to sigh. Julia clung to routine like it was the only thing keeping her sane. She would wake, bathe, dress with intention, and set the table for two. She made breakfast, even though Donovan rarely touched it. She ironed his shirts, even though they often ended up tossed aside. She spoke to God in whispers, in journal pages, in prayers folded into the corners of her bedsheets. "Lord, teach my hands to war and my fingers to fight," she murmured from Psalm 144, verse 1, not for a battle of fists, but one of survival. When pain becomes persistent, it either hardens or humbles. Julia chose neither. She became fire wrapped in silk, calm as a still lake, but deep enough to drown a secret. It wasn't until the night she overheard Donovan chuckling with Vanessa just outside the guest room that she felt something crack. Not a scream, not a curse, but a shift. Vanessa's laughter rang through the hallway like bells in a graveyard, joyful and chilling. Julia stood still, watching from behind the half-open door, her breath slow and deliberate. Vanessa entered the room with the comfort of someone who had unspoken permission. Donovan followed without hesitation. The door shut. That was the moment Julia stopped hoping. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She simply turned and walked into her bedroom, shutting her own door gently, as if sealing away what was left of her marriage. That night she didn't pray. She just sat, still, breathing, listening to the clock tick like a countdown to something she couldn't yet name. "There's a time for everything," she later read in Ecclesiastes 3 verse 1, "a time to be silent and a time to speak." She smiled faintly, not from joy, but from knowing her time was coming. The seed of silence had been planted long enough. And when it rose, it would not be an apology, it would bloom in thunder. The sky wore a dull gray that morning, as though the heavens had been warned of what Julia was about to face. She arrived at her gate, pulling a worn burgundy suitcase in one hand, a navy duffel on her shoulder, and her spirit dragging behind her like a wounded limb. The drive from Mapleton had been long and quiet, with every passing tree whispering memories of the home she longed to return to. Her thoughts were heavy but disciplined. She had braced herself for distance, but not for dismissal. When the taxi stopped in front of her home, she barely muttered a thank you, her eyes fixed on the pile of her belongings dumped like garbage just beyond the gate. 2 bags, one unzipped, exposing her undergarments to the world, her framed wedding photo, its glass cracked across Donovan's face, and a note pasted on the iron gate like a final verdict. It read, "You've been replaced. Do not force yourself in. Talk to your husband." The handwriting was Vanessa's, proud and theatrical, with curves and flourishes that mocked Julia's very existence. She didn't move. The wind lifted the corner of the note as if offering her a second chance to misunderstand it. But the meaning was as loud as thunder. She blinked, not to fight tears, but to register that this moment was real. Everything inside her wanted to believe it was a joke, some ugly misunderstanding, a cruel prank at most. But the locked gate and the silence from inside proved otherwise. She dialed Donovan's number, her fingers steady despite the quake in her chest. 1 ring, 2 voicemail, again. Nothing. She tried twice more before finally sitting down beside her bags on the pavement. A neighbor's car drove past slowly, and she could feel the gaze from behind the tinted glass. They knew. Greendale Heights always knew before the wounded even admitted it to themselves. A hummingbird hovered briefly near her head, then darted away, like joy having second thoughts. Julia sat with her back against the wall, legs stretched, her cream blouse gathering dust from the curb. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't even sad, not yet. She was stunned, the way the earth goes quiet before an earthquake. Every memory built in that house came back like a flood. Donovan dancing with her in the kitchen, their first fight over burnt rice, the morning they painted the nursery that never got used. Those memories now stood like orphans, abandoned by the very man who helped birth them. The betrayal wasn't in the eviction, it was in how effortlessly it had been carried out, how deliberate the cruelty had been. A kind woman who lived 4 houses away came out quietly, handing her a bottle of water and a white scarf to shield her from the sun. Julia accepted both with a soft thank you, her voice fragile but still polite. She didn't want pity, but she didn't have the strength to refuse kindness either. She sat there until dusk crept across the sky, painting the clouds with grief. When the last light faded, she rose, not like a broken woman, but like someone who knew defeat wasn't the end of the story. She gathered her things without rushing, hailed a cab, and gave the address of a modest guest house she had passed many times but never thought she'd need. The driver didn't speak, and she was grateful. When she reached her room, a simple space with a single bed, a chipped wardrobe, and a desk lamp that flickered, she sat on the mattress and stared at the peeling ceiling. There were no tears, only questions. She reached for her Bible, her fingers brushing over Psalm 27, verse 10. "Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me." Her lips barely moved as she read it, but it pulsed through her like electricity. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay awake staring into the dark, not defeated, not enraged, just quietly transforming. The following morning, Julia awoke not with bitterness, but with a strange sense of clarity, as if pain had washed her eyes clean. She sat up slowly, letting her legs hang over the edge of the bed, her toes curling against the cold tile. It was still early, the sun just a whisper behind the clouds. She opened the window and let the air in, along with the scent of roadside fried akara from a distant vendor. She smiled faintly. In a world where she had just been displaced, even the scent of beans and hot oil felt like an anchor to something real. She took a cold shower, dressed in a long brown skirt and a fitted blue blouse, and tied her hair back. There was no one to impress, but she needed to feel like herself. When she stepped out of the guest house, the air felt heavy but navigable. She walked, not to clear her mind, but to steady her heart. She passed schools, barber shops, fruit stalls. She watched life go on, indifferent to her storm. And yet in that moment she was not angry. She was learning that sometimes losing everything is what clears the path for a new beginning. That morning she bought a pen and notebook from a roadside vendor, and in a corner of the park she wrote one sentence. "They locked me out, but they've unknowingly opened something greater." Vanessa strolled through the corridors of an expensive boutique in Dubai, her heels clicking confidently against the marble tiles, oblivious to the firestorm she had sparked back home. With Donovan at her side, she tossed designer scarves and luxury handbags into the arms of an exhausted store assistant. She laughed louder than necessary, the kind of laugh people use when they are drunk on power. Donovan didn't say much. He simply followed her, his eyes scanning the room as though searching for something that money couldn't buy, but pride wouldn't let him admit. For Vanessa, this trip was a crowning moment, a celebration of conquest. She believed she had not only taken the man, but the life, the status, the home. In every photo she uploaded, every caption laced with hidden daggers, she carved out a throne for herself where she had once been a visitor. Living life like a queen, one of her posts read, with a winking emoji. But no amount of luxury could mask the truth that she was sitting on borrowed glory, dancing in shoes too big for her feet. As she posed beside Donovan in front of a gold-plated elevator, her smile wide and rehearsed, something inside her remained restless. Yet pride silenced that whisper. After all, the house was quiet, the wife was gone, and the world was applauding what it didn't understand. Back in Greendale Heights, the home she left in shambles had begun to change hands, not through rage or revenge, but through quiet, deliberate action. Julia, now stationed in her guest house sanctuary, moved with the composure of a woman who had cried her last tear in private. She wasn't calling friends to complain. She wasn't tearing down memories or plotting chaos. She was writing, praying, and making appointments. One of those appointments was with her family's long-standing lawyer, Mr. Benton, a slow-talking, hawk-eyed man who never smiled unless it was necessary. Sitting across from him in his quiet office, Julia placed a file on the table. Everything you need is in there. Title deed, trust certificate, transfer letter from my father's estate. Every legal proof that the house is mine, she said with a calm that could cut glass. Mr. Benton flipped through the documents slowly, nodding once. They don't know what they're standing on, he muttered. Not yet, Julia replied. But they will. For years, Donovan had assumed the house was his by virtue of their marriage, never bothering to ask, never imagining Julia had secured it in her name after her father's passing. She hadn't done it out of distrust. She did it out of wisdom. And now that wisdom had returned like a sword in her hand. Each day, Julia returned to her temporary lodging with a new layer of strength. The woman who once tiptoed around her emotions now walked in certainty. She spent mornings at the courthouse, afternoons revisiting documents, and evenings journaling her experiences with the grace of a wounded queen nursing herself back to health. She didn't tell a soul, not her aunt, not her old friends, because she knew that some storms are best weathered in silence. When the court date was fixed, she stood before the judge with poise, presenting the evidence that the Marston residence, the land it sat on, and even the deed of upgrade were all in her name. Donovan didn't appear at the hearing. He was still abroad, unaware that the walls he thought would forever house his ego were being lawfully reclaimed by the woman he discarded. Julia didn't seek vengeance, she sought closure. The gavel hit the block, the motion passed, and the house legally returned to her control with zero opposition. She walked out of the courthouse not like a victor, but like a woman who had simply returned what had always been hers. She muttered under her breath, "He prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Psalm 23, verse 5, and then smiled, not out of pride, but out of peace. The day Vanessa and Donovan returned from their escapade was one painted in poetic irony. A cloudless afternoon, bright and calm, the perfect weather for revelation. Their car pulled up at the familiar gates, which now looked unfamiliar with new locks and a changed security system. Vanessa stepped out in a beige jumpsuit and sunglasses, her head held high, unaware that the gates no longer opened to her fingers. Donovan, busy responding to emails, followed behind with a yawn. "Why is it locked?" Vanessa asked, pressing the bell with irritation. The guard, newly employed, stepped out. "Sorry, madam. You don't have access anymore." The owner gave strict instructions. Vanessa's laugh was short and sharp. "The owner?" she asked, flipping her hair. "I am the owner's partner." The guard looked unimpressed. "The owner's name is Julia Marston. She moved in 2 days ago." It was then that they noticed the boxes outside, neatly packed, labeled with Vanessa's name, Donovan's name, even their Dubai souvenirs. Beside them was a letter in Julia's handwriting. Return to sender. Key revoked. Access denied. Vanessa's hands trembled. Donovan stood frozen. And from the upstairs window, Julia watched them in silence, her gaze firm, her expression unreadable. They had evicted her once. Now, they stood evicted not by violence, but by quiet authority. The tides hadn't just turned. They had roared back with divine orchestration. Vanessa stood frozen in the driveway as if time had paused just for her humiliation to bloom in full color. The click of her heels suddenly sounded foreign to her, muffled by confusion and disbelief. Donovan remained by the car, staring at the locks like a man staring at a locked door in a dream, expecting it to vanish if he blinked long enough. The house that once felt like a conquest now loomed like a fortress guarding its rightful queen. For minutes, the two of them stood in limbo, weighed down by the realization that something irreversible had taken place. Vanessa turned sharply and began banging on the gate, shouting Julia's name as if her voice could reverse legal filings and spiritual authority. Julia remained behind the curtain, watching with the detachment of someone who had already cried all the tears there were to cry. Her heart didn't race. Her fingers didn't tremble. She stood like a tower, still unmoved, unreadable. What once broke her now bored her. Outside, Vanessa cursed under her breath, her words wild and aimless, like arrows shot into the wind with no target. Donovan tried to speak, tried to grasp at an explanation, but his mouth was full of sand. He knew, somehow, somewhere, he had miscalculated the strength of the woman he threw away. Inside the house, the air felt different. It was no longer heavy with mourning or echoing with the past. Julia had repainted the living room in soft tones of cream and gold, not to erase the history, but to sanctify it. Each brushstroke felt like restoration. The curtains no longer smelled of expensive cologne that wasn't hers, and the bed sheets had been changed, as if to announce that new authority slept here now. There was a calm power in reclaiming her space without bitterness, in restoring her domain without dramatic flair. She sat on the sofa with her Bible open on her lap, flipping through the pages not in search of escape, but confirmation. Her eyes fell on Proverbs 31, verse 25. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. She read it aloud like a declaration. Outside, the commotion grew louder, Vanessa's voice climbing octaves of panic and pride, but Julia didn't flinch. She reached for the remote and turned on soft gospel music. The melody filled the house like incense, drowning out the chaos outside. She didn't need to speak. Her silence was louder than their shouting. Her presence inside those walls was the answer to every question their hearts were too arrogant to ask. Eventually, the shouting stopped. Perhaps Vanessa realized the gate wasn't going to open just because she demanded it. Perhaps Donovan finally admitted, at least to himself, that the house was never his to give away. Whatever the reason, the noise faded, replaced by awkward rustling as they sorted through their belongings, dumped at the curb. Julia had been meticulous. Each item had been packed with care but no sentiment, like closing a file at the end of a case. There were no theatrics, no broken glass or scattered shoes, just labels and boxes, and the unspoken message that said, "This chapter is over." Vanessa opened a box labeled toiletries and let out a gasp when she saw her diamond-studded toothbrush case cracked. It was a small crack, hardly noticeable, but it felt symbolic. Even her vanity had been touched by this storm. Donovan sat on the trunk of the car, staring into space. No one said anything to him, not even Vanessa. She was too busy trying to save face, arranging her things like someone waiting for paparazzi. But the only cameras rolling were the silent eyes of neighbors behind tinted windows and curtain slits, each capturing the downfall they knew would come. The same way birds scatter before a storm, they had sensed the shift. After hours under the sun, the car finally reversed down the driveway, slower than it had arrived. Vanessa didn't wave. Donovan didn't glance back. They drove off not like two people wronged, but like thieves who couldn't believe the house had an alarm after all. Inside, Julia watched the taillights disappear before finally closing the curtain. She didn't feel triumphant, she felt clean. The house exhaled with her, as if both of them had been waiting to breathe again. She walked through the rooms, touching the walls, whispering, "Peace, be still." Every step echoed healing. In the kitchen, she brewed a cup of tea, the steam curling upward like a prayer answered. She looked out the window again, not to check if they were gone, but to soak in the quiet. There was no rage left in her, only resolve. What they had taken was temporary. What she reclaimed was eternal, her dignity, her voice, her home. In the notebook on her kitchen table, she wrote, "God does not play dice with his daughters. He moves with purpose, and when he allows the breaking, it's because he's preparing to build better." She closed the book and leaned back, her eyes resting on the walls that once watched her cry, but now bore witness to her restoration. Donovan sat on the edge of his hotel bed, shoulders hunched like a man carrying the ruins of a collapsed temple. The television in the background murmured softly, but he wasn't watching. The lights were on, but his mind was locked in shadow. Vanessa had just stepped out after another argument, something about blame, something about embarrassment, but he didn't hear half of what she said. His thoughts were buried deep in that silent moment at the gate, the guard's blank stare, Julia's absence, the packed boxes, the letter she had signed in her calm cursive. That moment had not just closed a door, it had crushed a delusion. He had believed, foolishly, that love was something transferable, like bank ownership or title deeds. He had assumed Julia would always wait, always bend, always forgive. He never expected her silence to be the blade that cut his fantasy to shreds. He now understood that she hadn't just left the house that day, she had left his heart entirely. And the house, that majestic monument he once paraded Vanessa through, now felt like holy ground he had been banished from. Like Adam outside Eden, he could no longer return, not because of a locked gate, but because of a decision sealed in heaven. He picked up his phone, staring at Julia's number. He had deleted it in anger once, but some numbers burn into memory like scars. His thumb hovered, hesitant. What would he even say? That he was sorry? That he was stupid? That he thought she would never rise? Every apology he rehearsed in his mind sounded like mud splattered on marble. He had taken her for granted, thinking her silence meant surrender, not strategy. He remembered her softness, the way she served him meals even when he didn't ask, the way she prayed for him when he didn't deserve it. He remembered the time he came home drunk, and she placed a warm towel on his forehead without a word. He remembered the birthday when he forgot his own age, and she reminded him with a surprise dinner and the laughter of friends he didn't know she contacted. Those memories returned like uninvited guests, knocking at the walls of his guilt. And now, Vanessa's presence irritated him. Her voice, once thrilling, now grated like sandpaper. She walked around blaming everyone but herself, oblivious to the role she played in a game none of them won. Donovan felt something crack inside, not a breakdown, but an awakening. He had lost Julia not to another man, but to herself. She had finally seen her worth, and the echo of that truth was now deafening. Julia, meanwhile, moved through her restored home like a woman returning to the rhythm of her breath. She didn't rush to furnish every corner or repaint every memory. She allowed the house to heal with her, one room at a time. Each step she took across the tiled floor felt like reclaiming a verse of her own story. The guest room that once housed whispers and betrayal had now become a library, its shelves slowly filling with the books she used to read before marriage consumed her time. The bed was removed. In its place stood a reading chair, a lamp, and a framed photo of her parents, reminders of love that had no secrets, no games, just legacy. She spent her mornings on the veranda, sipping tea and journaling in the sunlight, her handwriting steady, her heart softer but firmer. Sometimes the wind would bring a scent that reminded her of Donovan's cologne, but she no longer flinched. She acknowledged it, then let it pass like a cloud. Healing, she had learned, was not an event but a process, one where old wounds taught new wisdom. She smiled more now, not wide grins for show, but small, private smiles that bloomed when no one was looking. There was something sacred in solitude, something that no man or mistress could steal. Her phone buzzed one afternoon, an unknown number. She stared at it, knowing who it might be. She let it ring, twice, 3 times. Then silence. She didn't call back. Later that evening, a message appeared. "Julia, I just want to talk, please." No name. But names weren't needed. The weight of the sender was in the silence between the words. She read the message once, then deleted it. No response. She had nothing left to say. Forgiveness was already given in her heart, not because he earned it, but because she needed it for herself. But access was a different matter. Access was earned. Access was sacred. She folded her phone shut and went back to her book. Isaiah 43 verses 18 to 19 stared up at her. Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing. She underlined it slowly, her hand firm. That night, she lit a scented candle, turned on soft piano music, and prepared dinner, not out of loneliness, but as a love letter to herself. She sat at the table alone and gave thanks. Not for the pain, not for the betrayal, but for the strength it took to rise from it. And in that quiet kitchen, lit by peace, she felt full, not of food, but of life. The morning Donovan showed up at her gate was one where the sky wore a velvet gray, and the scent of rain hung in the air like a promise. He wasn't dressed like the confident man who once ruled the driveway, nor did he walk like someone with entitlement still burning in his chest. He stood outside the gate like a child who had wandered too far and was now hoping someone would recognize him. In his hand he held nothing, no flowers, no apology card, no grand gesture, just his trembling fingers and the weight of regret that had made a home on his shoulders. The security guard, new and unaware of their history, asked for his name with polite detachment. "Donovan," he said, as though the name itself had rusted in his throat. Tell her I'm here to speak with her." The guard nodded, walked into the compound, and delivered the message exactly as instructed. Julia had been sitting on the front porch in a flowing coral dress, her feet bare, a book resting open on her lap. She looked up, not startled, not confused, just thoughtful, as if she'd known this moment would eventually arrive like an unpaid debt circling back. She didn't rush to meet him. She didn't even rise. Instead, she closed her book gently, placed it on the wicker table beside her, and took a deep breath that smelled of jasmine and old memories. When she finally stood and walked to the gate, her steps were unhurried, regal, purposeful. She stopped a few feet away from him, close enough to see the lines that had deepened around his eyes, but far enough to remind him of the distance his choices had created. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind stirred between them like an invisible wall. Donovan was the first to break the silence, his voice rough like gravel. I came to say I was wrong." Julia tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "About what?" she asked, not with sarcasm, but with a precision that cut deeper than anger. He looked down, searching for words he no longer knew how to use. "About everything," he said finally. "About how I treated you. About what I threw away. I thought you would always be there, Julia. I thought I had time." Her eyes, calm and steady, never left his. "You had time," she replied, "but you used it building someone else's house while burning mine." She didn't raise her voice, but her words hit with the weight of stone tablets. He lowered his eyes again, the shame settling deeper than any apology could reach. Vanessa was nowhere in sight. The last Julia had heard, she had packed her bags and left Greendale entirely. Some said she had moved to another city to start over. Others whispered that she had found another man to orbit. But Julia didn't care. That chapter was closed. Her battle had never been with Vanessa. It was with the version of herself that allowed things to go unspoken for too long. And that version had died quietly the day she picked her luggage from the sidewalk and walked away. Now, standing in the very place she had once been discarded, Julia felt no need to retaliate. There was no anger left to harvest. "I don't hate you, Donovan," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But I don't belong to you anymore. You buried what we had, and I'm not a woman who goes digging through graves." He blinked, the words slicing through his chest like ice. "I don't expect anything," he murmured. "I just wanted you to know I'm sorry." She nodded, offering no comfort, but no cruelty either. "Sometimes sorry is just a key to a door that no longer exists," she said, then turned around and walked back into the compound. The gate closed behind her not with a slam, but with finality. The kind of closing that doesn't need a lock. That evening, after the rain finally arrived and soaked the world in silence, Julia sat by her window and watched droplets race down the glass like tiny messengers from heaven. The house glowed with warm lights. the smell of roasted vegetables filling the air, and the sound of soft jazz humming in the background. She wasn't celebrating, she was simply existing, but fully. She didn't feel victorious. She felt anchored. There was no parade, no audience, no spotlight. Just peace, the kind that often arrives on tiptoes after the storm has screamed itself hoarse. She thought about the girl she had been, the one who made excuses for absence, who prayed for her husband's eyes to find her again. That girl was gone, laid to rest in the pages of her old journals. In her place stood a woman who had learned that survival was never the goal, wholeness was. She poured herself a glass of Zobo, garnished it with mint from her garden, and raised it toward the empty seat across from her, not in mourning, but in gratitude. "To growth," she whispered, then took a sip. As the last song on her playlist played, her eyes wandered to the Bible on her table, still open from the morning's reading. She smiled when she saw the verse she had underlined in the pale light of dawn. "He who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion." Philippians 1 verse 6. And in that moment, she knew there was no return to who she was because she had stepped fully into who she was meant to become. Here's an advice for you all. Sometimes, the greatest breakthroughs come after the deepest betrayals. If you've ever been locked out of someone's heart, pushed aside like your worth was disposable, or made to question your value because of someone else's blindness, know this: you were never discarded, you were being repositioned. There's something sacred about the silence that comes after heartbreak. It's in that quiet place that God begins to show you who you really are, without the noise of someone else's opinion or neglect. Like Julia, your pain may not have received an apology, but your peace doesn't require one. Not every fight is yours to fight loudly. Some victories are birthed in private, with God as your only audience. So if you're listening and you feel like you've been wronged, betrayed, replaced, or even humiliated, do not rush to retaliate. Let your healing be louder than your anger. Let your restoration speak volumes. Sometimes the most powerful sentence you can speak is simply, "I've moved on," and mean it. You are not forgotten. You are not finished. You are being refined. The same way Julia took back her keys, her peace, her name, you too will reclaim what is yours. And when you do, it will be with dignity, not drama. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for being the God who sees, the God who heals, and the God who restores. For every listener right now who feels broken by betrayal, rejected by those they trusted, or cast aside by those they loved, Lord, I ask for divine comfort to flood their spirit like rivers of peace. For the woman who was locked out emotionally, physically, or spiritually, give her back double for her trouble. For the man who was left in silence, not knowing what went wrong, wrap him in your wisdom and clarity. For the one who stayed too long in places that drained them, Father, awaken their strength to walk away with grace. May you remind every heart listening that their worth is not tied to who left, but to who they belong to, and they belong to you. Just as you turned Julia's pain into power, do it for them. Lift them from the ashes and plant their feet on solid ground. Lord, teach them that revenge is never sweeter than peace, and that healing is the real clap back. Let your word be their compass, your presence their hiding place, and your favor their testimony. We declare over every listener, this is not your end. This is your elevation. This is your turning point. This is your revival. What was taken shall be returned. What was broken shall be rebuilt. What was delayed shall be delivered. In the name of Jesus, beauty for ashes, oil of joy for mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. If you believe this, wherever you are, lift your voice and say, Amen. Us to the end of this story, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel, and may God bless you for doing so. Bye.